It was a quiet, unassuming afternoon in the heart of Washington, D.C., when Justice Sonia Sotomayor, ever the model of dedication and discipline, returned from a long day at the Supreme Court. The sun hung low, casting a soft glow across the streets, and for a brief moment, everything felt right in the world. She smiled to herself as she thought of the weekend getaway planned for her family. But little did she know, her upcoming family trip was about to intersect with something far darker than she could imagine, a political scheme with ramifications that could shake the very foundations of justice. Her family, eager for a break, had planned a simple retreat to a remote mansion in upstate New York. A few days of peace, away from the ever-present tension of Washington, was exactly what they needed. However, unbeknownst to Justice Sotomayor, this seemingly innocuous getaway would pull her and her loved ones straight into the center of a plot devised by none other than former President Donald Trump. The wheels of this nefarious scheme were already set in motion, hidden behind layers of secrecy, manipulation, and well-placed allies. And it all started with a seemingly innocent invitation. It was a gesture designed to lure them in, to make them feel safe and welcome, unaware of the trap being carefully laid before them. As Justice Sotomayor's family settled into the luxurious, sprawling mansion in the hills, they were unaware that every step they took on the property was one step closer to unknowingly becoming pawns in a much larger political game. Little did they know, the quiet retreat they had planned was exactly what Trump had been waiting for, the perfect place to ignite his grand plan. And the man behind it all? Someone with close ties to the former president, someone who had been quietly pulling strings in the background for months. As Justice Sotomayor and her family settled in, they were greeted by the owner of the mansion, a charming and hospitable figure named Thomas Avery. He was the kind of person who exuded warmth, his mannerisms inviting and disarming. He introduced himself as the caretaker of the estate, speaking with a tone that made it sound as if he had been waiting for them personally. Avery's polished demeanor made it easy to forget that there was more to him than met the eye. Thomas had carefully cultivated his role, and his true loyalty lay with the Trump Organization, a fact that remained hidden from the esteemed justice. The mansion she and her family had rented, by all accounts, was a luxurious getaway. Yet, Thomas had other orders. The property wasn't just a retreat for weary minds, it had been carefully selected for one reason: proximity to a hidden meeting room that had been set up for a clandestine political rendezvous. As the sun dipped below the horizon, and the family relaxed on the patio with glasses of wine, a knock at the door interrupted the serene evening. Thomas, ever the gracious host, answered it, and to his surprise, or perhaps not so much, he welcomed a well-dressed man who had clearly traveled far. This man, an enigmatic figure who went by the name Gregory Hale, was known to few outside of certain elite circles. Hale was a man whose connections to Trump's political endeavors were vast. Though his name was rarely mentioned in the media, he had quietly amassed a reputation for being a fixer, someone who could navigate the murky waters of political schemes and media control. His presence in the mansion was no coincidence. Gregory Hale didn't approach Justice Sotomayor directly, but his quiet influence loomed large, especially as he mingled with the guests. He spoke of nothing but innocuous topics: the weather, the recent changes in the political landscape, and the occasional vague reference to things getting interesting in Washington. But it wasn't lost on those who knew how to read between the lines that Hale's seemingly casual conversations were full of double meanings and veiled threats. The family was unaware, enjoying the evening under the assumption that their retreat was a break from the pressure of their high-profile lives. But as they laughed and chatted with Thomas Avery and Gregory Hale, the subtle pull of a carefully laid trap began to tighten. Without knowing it, Justice Sotomayor's family was inching ever closer to the eye of a storm they had no part in creating. Unbeknownst to them, Hale was tasked with a singular mission: ensure that the Sotomayor family was present when the political game Trump had designed would unfold. Their mere presence would be the key, and with each passing hour, the situation became increasingly dangerous. The night carried on with laughter and conversation, but the air was thick with an unspoken tension. Gregory Hale continued to engage with Justice Sotomayor's family, subtly guiding the conversation toward political matters. At first, it seemed like casual chatter about the state of the nation, but to anyone familiar with his true intentions, it was a calculated attempt to gauge the justice's family's vulnerabilities. It wasn't long before he began dropping hints about a game-changing move coming from Washington. Sotomayor, typically the calm and measured figure, brushed off his remarks, choosing instead to focus on the tranquility of the evening. But her niece, Maria, who was visiting with her, was less dismissive. A political science student, she was intrigued by Hale's cryptic comments. Maria had always been sharp, and though she didn't know it yet, her curiosity would soon entangle her in the scheme unfolding around them. As the night wore on, the family retired to their rooms, but Maria found herself unable to sleep. She walked through the grand halls of the mansion, unable to shake the odd sense of unease that had settled in her gut. She passed by a door that had been left slightly ajar, and curiosity got the best of her. Inside, she saw Hale, his back to the door, speaking in low tones with Thomas Avery. The conversation was hushed, but she could make out a few words: Sotomayor, inevitable, allies, next steps. Maria stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't fully understand what they were saying, but the tone of their voices left no doubt, they were discussing something far beyond casual politics. The mention of her aunt's name was enough to set off alarm bells in her mind. Suddenly, Avery turned toward the door. Maria quickly stepped back, her heart racing. She barely managed to avoid being spotted, retreating down the hall with the intention of confronting her aunt in the morning. But as she made her way to her room, a chilling thought struck her: what if this was no accident? What if this was all somehow tied to her aunt's position on the Supreme Court? The next morning, Maria approached Justice Sotomayor over breakfast, trying to maintain a calm exterior. She mentioned what she had overheard, though she left out the more personal details of the conversation. Sotomayor listened, her expression unreadable. "I'm sure it's nothing, Maria," she said gently. "People talk about politics all the time. It's likely just coincidence." But even as she spoke those words, a knot of unease tightened in her stomach. She had spent enough time in Washington to know that nothing was ever just a coincidence. She was beginning to wonder whether their peaceful retreat had been orchestrated for far darker purposes. Later that afternoon, Sotomayor made a decision. She called an old friend from her time as a district judge in New York, someone who knew the political world inside and out. She spoke briefly, but with urgency, urging him to look into the mansion's owner, Thomas Avery, and his connections. The friend promised to dig into it, but the wheels were already turning. The trap was set, and the people behind it were becoming aware that the justice was starting to question her surroundings. Meanwhile, in the shadows, Gregory Hale and Thomas Avery were preparing for the next phase of their scheme, one that would directly involve Justice Sotomayor in ways that no one could have anticipated. The game was now in motion, and whether she knew it or not, her family was at the center of it all. By the following afternoon, Justice Sotomayor's concerns had escalated from mere suspicion to certainty. Her friend in New York had uncovered unsettling information about Thomas Avery. It turned out Avery's ties to Gregory Hale weren't just casual acquaintances, they were deep, layered with political maneuvers that reached back to the highest levels of power, including Donald Trump's inner circle. Avery had been a trusted ally in past schemes that were shrouded in secrecy. But none of it explained why her family had been invited to this particular mansion, at this particular time. The more she learned, the more the pieces of the puzzle started to fit into place. There was a coordinated effort underway, something that used her position as a Supreme Court justice as a pawn in a larger, more dangerous game. But the question remained: why her family? Why now? That evening, as the sun dipped once again beneath the horizon, Justice Sotomayor decided to confront the two men directly. She called for a meeting with Thomas Avery and Gregory Hale in the mansion study, a room where many of the family's conversations had taken place during their stay. The study was richly decorated, filled with bookshelves that lined the walls and dark mahogany furniture. The weight of the room felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves were listening. When Avery and Hale entered, they wore smiles, but it was a thinly veiled mask. They knew the justice had been digging into their backgrounds, and they had prepared for this moment. I need answers, Sotomayor said, her voice calm but firm. You both know something. Something that involves my family, and I want to know what it is. For a moment, there was silence. Hale, who had remained eerily calm throughout their interactions, spoke first. Justice Sotomayor, he said smoothly, his tone almost respectful. We were hoping to avoid this confrontation, but I suppose we can't keep the truth from you any longer. Avery, standing slightly behind Hale, nodded subtly. It's not as simple as you think, he said. You're not here by chance, Justice. You and your family were carefully selected to play a role in something that will change the course of history. Sotomayor's heart raced as she began to piece together their words. This was bigger than politics. This wasn't just about Washington or any specific party. This was a scheme designed to manipulate the Supreme Court itself, and she had unknowingly walked right into the middle of it. We've been watching your career closely, Sonia, Hale continued. The time has come for certain decisions to be made, and you, with all due respect, are a key figure in those decisions. Your family's presence here is necessary. Sotomayor's mind reeled. What decisions? What role am I supposed to play? Avery stepped forward, his voice lowering, more conspiratorial now. You see, Justice, there's a push to have certain legal cases brought before the Supreme Court that could tilt the balance of power in favor of specific interests. Your presence here is not an accident. You have been chosen, or perhaps more accurately, your family has been chosen, to encourage a decision that benefits the right side. Hale nodded in agreement. And those decisions, Justice, would be in line with the kind of change that Mr. Trump's circle has been advocating for. We need your vote on the right cases. We need you to be in our corner when the time comes. Sotomayor's blood ran cold. She had known for years how power players manipulated the system, but this was something different. This wasn't just about political games, this was an all-out attempt to influence the highest court in the land by exploiting the personal connections and vulnerabilities of those within it. What are you asking me to do? She demanded, her voice no longer calm but steely with resolve. This is extortion. You're trying to manipulate me with my family. You think that I can be bought like that? Gregory Hale's smile was sharp and unsettling. Not bought, Justice. Persuaded. You see, your family is valuable. Your niece, Maria, has already shown an interest in politics. Her curiosity is beneficial to us. And the way she's been made to feel welcome here is part of the larger plan. We've given you all the space to think, all the time you need to come to the realization that your family's future is intertwined with this. The truth of their words hit like a punch to the gut. Maria, whose curiosity had already started unraveling their plan, was in more danger than Sotomayor had realized. They had been manipulating the entire situation, every word, every gesture, every part of this so-called getaway had been part of the game. And now her family was caught in the crossfire of a political war that she hadn't even known existed. Sotomayor stood, her chair scraping against the floor as she rose to her feet. This ends now, she said, her voice unwavering. You're mistaken if you think you can control me. Or my family. Hale and Avery exchanged glances, but neither moved. It was clear that they were ready for whatever came next. But Sotomayor wasn't backing down. This had gone beyond the point of no return. The real battle was just beginning, and it was going to take everything she had to protect her family, and the integrity of the Supreme Court itself. The days following the confrontation in the study were marked by a tense quiet. Justice Sotomayor, resolute in her determination, spent hours each day weighing her options. The pull of the scheme, the pressure to go along with what Hale and Avery were proposing, was formidable. But her dedication to the law, to justice, and to the principle of fairness, left her with no choice but to refuse their demands, no matter what the consequences. Meanwhile, Thomas Avery and Gregory Hale, though outwardly calm, were beginning to show cracks in their composure. They had miscalculated in underestimating her resolve. But they were not about to let their plans unravel so easily. The stakes were too high, and they knew that, in this game, no one could be allowed to walk away unscathed. It wasn't long before Maria began to notice that something was wrong. She'd overheard enough of the conversations between the men to understand that her aunt was in danger. Though Justice Sotomayor had tried to shield her from the worst of it, Maria wasn't naive. She knew the consequences of crossing people like Hale and Avery, and she wasn't about to sit back and do nothing. One evening, as the family sat around the grand dining table, Maria spoke up, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "Aunt Sonia," she began, her gaze fixed on her aunt, "there's something we need to discuss. I think I've figured out enough to understand what's going on here. These people, they're trying to use us. They're manipulating us to get to you." Sotomayor looked at her niece, her expression softening, but there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. "I know, Maria. I've been trying to keep you all out of this, but it's clear that we're in deeper than I originally thought." The rest of the family exchanged uneasy glances. They had all sensed that something wasn't right, but it had never been explicitly discussed. Now, with Maria's words, the reality of their situation had fully set in. "We need to leave," Maria insisted. "It's the only way to get out of this before it goes any further." Justice Sotomayor nodded in agreement, but she knew it wasn't that simple. Leaving the mansion, or worse, fleeing the area entirely, would only raise suspicions. Avery and Hale would know they were onto them, and they'd stop at nothing to ensure that their plan continued to move forward. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Sotomayor quietly left her room and stepped into the mansion's library. She needed time to think, time to plan. The weight of what she was facing pressed down on her shoulders, but she couldn't afford to let it show. She had to be the protector, the guardian of her family's safety, even if it meant making dangerous decisions. As she scrolled through her phone, trying to find a way to reach her contacts in the legal world without alarming Avery or Hale, she was startled by a sudden sound, a soft knock at the library door. She froze, heart racing. She hadn't expected anyone to be up at this hour. The door creaked open, and to her surprise, it was Gregory Hale who stepped inside. His expression was unreadable, his eyes calculating. "You don't need to hide from me, Justice," he said in a low voice, his tone almost coaxing. "I can see that you're a woman of principle. But principles can only take you so far. You know as well as I do that the game is much bigger than you. Your family, your career, they are all part of something much more significant now. You can't just walk away from that." Sotomayor stood her ground, refusing to show fear. "I'll never let you manipulate me. And I'll never let you use my family to further your agenda." Hale's smile didn't falter, but it wasn't reassuring. "We don't want to manipulate you, Justice. We want you to understand the necessity of the choices in front of you. You're standing at the crossroads of history. What we're offering you isn't power, but influence, a chance to make decisions that will shape this nation for years to come." Sotomayor shook her head. "I don't need your influence. The law is not something to be bent to personal gain. It's about fairness, about truth. You want to corrupt it. And I won't stand for that." Gregory Hale studied her for a moment, then took a step closer. "You're a smart woman, Sonia. You know that the world doesn't run on ideals. It runs on power. And we can help you protect everything you hold dear. If you play along, you and your family will be untouchable. But if you stand in our way, we'll make sure you regret it." His words hung in the air like a thin thread of threat, and for the first time, Sotomayor felt a shiver run down her spine. She had been so focused on protecting her family, on maintaining the integrity of the court, that she hadn't fully comprehended just how dangerous Hale and Avery were. They weren't just manipulating the system, they were willing to destroy anyone who stood in their way. "I won't be intimidated," she said firmly, though she knew it was a lie. Deep down, she could feel the weight of their words bearing down on her. Hale smirked and turned to leave. "You'll change your mind, Justice. You'll see things from our side soon enough." As the door closed behind him, Sotomayor's resolve hardened. She knew she had to act fast. The trap was closing in on her family, and she couldn't afford to wait any longer. Tomorrow, she would make her move, even if it meant risking everything. The following morning, the atmosphere in the mansion had shifted. It was no longer the peaceful retreat they had imagined. Instead, it felt like a carefully orchestrated stage where each member of the family was unknowingly playing a part in a high-stakes drama. Justice Sotomayor could feel the pressure mounting, but there was no turning back now. She had to find a way to outmaneuver Hale and Avery, or everything she had worked for, her career, her family's safety, the integrity of the Supreme Court itself, would be destroyed. That day, she called Maria aside for a private conversation. The young woman had been her anchor throughout the ordeal, asking the tough questions and challenging the narrative Hale and Avery had so carefully spun. "Maria, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Sotomayor said, her voice low but urgent. "Things are much worse than I initially thought. These men, Avery and Hale, they have no intention of letting us leave here in peace. They've made it clear that they want something from me, something political, something dangerous." Maria looked at her aunt, a mix of concern and determination in her eyes. "What are we going to do?" "I've been thinking about what Hale said, about how we're already caught up in this. If we try to leave, it could make things worse." Sotomayor nodded grimly. "Exactly. They're watching us. They'll make sure we don't get out of here alive if it means securing their plan. But if we stay passive, they'll use us, and they'll use you, Maria, to get to me. You've already seen how manipulative they can be." Maria swallowed hard, realizing the weight of her aunt's words. "So what's the plan?" Sotomayor's mind was working rapidly. She had a plan, one that involved using the very thing they were trying to exploit against them, their own arrogance. Gregory Hale and Thomas Avery were convinced that their manipulation was subtle, that they were in control. But what they didn't realize was that the justice had a few tricks left to play. "Tonight," she said, a quiet resolve settling in her voice, "we're going to turn the tables. I've already contacted someone I trust, a colleague from the court who owes me a favor. They're going to help us make sure Hale and Avery's plans come to light, no matter what it costs." Maria nodded, understanding the risk. "You really think they'll help us?" "I don't have a choice," Sotomayor said firmly. "We're playing in their game now. But if we're smart, we can expose them for what they are before they can put their plans into action." That night, the atmosphere in the mansion was thick with tension. The family gathered around for dinner, each of them acutely aware that the time for confrontation was drawing near. Despite the underlying danger, they ate in relative silence, their thoughts consumed by the knowledge that everything was about to change. After dinner, Sotomayor quietly excused herself. She made her way to the library, where Hale and Avery were likely waiting to discuss the next steps of their manipulative scheme. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. The colleague from the court had confirmed that they were ready to act. As she entered the library, she was greeted by the familiar faces of Thomas Avery and Gregory Hale. But tonight, they were different. Their smiles were colder, their eyes more calculating. They had prepared for the inevitable confrontation, but they had underestimated how much Sonia Sotomayor was willing to risk to protect everything she held dear. "Well, Justice," Hale said with a smirk, "I trust you've thought about our offer. It's not often someone gets an opportunity like this." Sotomayor stood tall, unwavering. "I've made my decision, Mr. Hale," she said, her voice strong. "I'll never be part of your scheme. And I'll make sure that everyone knows exactly what you've been doing." The room seemed to hold its breath. Avery's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake, Justice. A dangerous mistake." But just as he spoke, Sotomayor's phone buzzed again. She looked down at it, a message flashing across the screen, "We're in position. Prepare to act." Before Hale or Avery could respond, the sound of a door slamming open echoed through the mansion. A team of federal agents, led by her trusted colleague from the court, stormed into the room. They had been ready to move when Sotomayor gave the signal. "What's this?" Hale demanded, his composure finally cracking. "What is this?" "You've been caught," Sotomayor said, her voice filled with cold resolve. "All of it, your scheme, your manipulation, everything. You'll be arrested for attempting to influence a Supreme Court justice, and for trying to corrupt the judicial system itself." The agents moved swiftly, securing Hale and Avery before they could react. The look of shock on their faces was enough to tell Sotomayor that they hadn't anticipated being exposed so soon. As the agents led them away, Sotomayor turned to her family, who had gathered anxiously outside the door. Maria's face was filled with a mix of relief and exhaustion. "Are we safe?" Maria asked softly. "For now," Sotomayor replied, her gaze steady. "But this isn't over. This is just the beginning. We've won this battle, but there will be more challenges ahead." Sotomayor knew that the road ahead would be far from easy. But as she looked around at her family, her sister, her niece, everyone she had fought to protect, she knew that no matter what, she would never back down from defending justice. Not now, not ever. And though this chapter was over, the fight for the truth was just beginning. The arrest of Gregory Hale and Thomas Avery sent shockwaves through the political world. The scheme to manipulate Justice Sotomayor had been unraveled, but its implications ran much deeper than anyone had anticipated. It was just the tip of the iceberg, and the fallout from exposing the operation would leave political scars across the nation. Sotomayor knew this well. The battle wasn't over, and the war for the integrity of the Supreme Court was only beginning. The family, now out of immediate danger, returned to their home, but the sense of unease never quite left. The world that had seemed so distant from their lives only days before was now a constant presence, lurking in the background, waiting for any sign of weakness. For Justice Sotomayor, the calm after the storm was fleeting. The following week saw her in meetings with security experts, her colleagues at the court, and several trusted figures from law enforcement who had been integral to uncovering the full extent of the conspiracy. The political elite was not willing to let this scandal go unnoticed, and her every move was now being scrutinized by forces both known and unknown. One afternoon, as she sat at her desk, sorting through an avalanche of paperwork, a call came in. It was her colleague, Justice Elena Kagan, who had been following the developments closely. "Sonia," Elena's voice crackled over the line, "we need to talk. There's something else going on here. Something bigger." Sotomayor's heart sank. "What is it, Elena?" "We've been looking into some of the players involved with Hale and Avery. They weren't just working alone. They were part of a much larger network, one that's been quietly influencing the judiciary for years. The deeper we dig, the more we find connections to political figures who want to reshape the courts entirely. This isn't just about influencing your vote, Sonia. This is a larger agenda to control the entire judicial system." Sotomayor leaned back in her chair, the weight of Elena's words sinking in. "So they've been trying to corrupt the court for a long time. But why now? Why target me?" Elena hesitated before responding, her voice grave. "They've been waiting for the right moment. You're a strong, respected figure on the bench, and they knew that if they could manipulate you, they could shift the balance in their favor. But now that Hale and Avery are out of the picture, the people behind them will escalate. This isn't over, Sonia. They'll come for you again, but next time, they won't be so obvious." Sotomayor nodded slowly. The fight she had been thrust into was far from finished. If anything, it had only just begun. But she wasn't going to back down. Not when everything she stood for, the integrity of the court, the sanctity of justice, the safety of her family, was at stake. "I won't let them win, Elena," she said, her voice hard with resolve. "I'll fight this until the very end. But we need to be prepared. I'll need your help." Elena agreed without hesitation. "We're in this together. We'll make sure the truth doesn't get buried." The weeks that followed were filled with careful planning, constant vigilance, and a quiet resolve that strengthened with each passing day. Sotomayor's every move was calculated, not just for her own safety, but for the protection of the judiciary as a whole. She worked closely with other justices, ensuring they remained united against the growing political pressure that threatened to tear the court apart. But in the shadows, the enemies she had exposed were regrouping. They weren't going to give up so easily. New players, more discreet and more dangerous, began to emerge. And with every whisper of their movements, Sotomayor knew the net was tightening around her and her family once again. One evening, as she prepared for a meeting with security officers, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She hesitated but answered. "This is Justice Sotomayor," she said cautiously. "Sonia," the voice on the other end was clipped, professional. It was an investigator from the FBI. "We need to talk. We've found something. Something you need to know." Her stomach clenched. "What is it?" "We've uncovered a deep network of political operatives. They've been working with people inside the government, and they're using information against you. The next step in their plan is something far more dangerous, an attack, not on you directly, but on your credibility. They're going to smear you in the media, discredit everything you've ever stood for." Sotomayor's pulse quickened. She had always known that the enemies of justice would stop at nothing, but this felt personal. They weren't just targeting her decisions, they were targeting her very existence on the bench. "We're working on it, Sonia. We have people monitoring the situation, but you need to be aware that it's going to get ugly. They'll stop at nothing to destroy your reputation." She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. "I'm not backing down. Tell your team to be ready. They won't break me." As she hung up the phone, the gravity of the situation settled in. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about ensuring that justice would survive, that the court, the Constitution, and the American people wouldn't fall victim to the people who were willing to bend the law for their own power. The battlefield had expanded, and it was no longer confined to the mansion in upstate New York. It was everywhere, from the halls of Congress to the corridors of the Supreme Court. And Sonia Sotomayor was determined to stand her ground, no matter the cost. This was war, and she was ready to fight. The storm had been brewing for weeks. Each passing day had brought new challenges, new threats, and new revelations about the scale of the conspiracy against Justice Sotomayor. But with every obstacle, her resolve had only strengthened. She had faced political manipulation, personal attacks, and the ruthless game of power, but she had refused to back down. Now, the final confrontation was at hand. Sotomayor stood in the Supreme Court, looking out across the Grand Chamber. The marble pillars, the historic symbolism, it all seemed to stand in stark contrast to the shadowy undercurrents that had been swirling around her for months. This room, the seat of American justice, was under siege. But she would not let it fall. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. A powerful network of operatives, connected to the remnants of Hale and Avery's scheme, had been orchestrating a disinformation campaign. The goal was to destroy her credibility in front of the American people. They would use the media, they would use leaks, and they would stop at nothing to ensure she was discredited. But what they didn't count on was the sheer force of her will. Her team had been working behind the scenes, carefully countering the misinformation. The FBI had gathered enough evidence to expose the full extent of the conspiracy. The connections, the backroom deals, the political maneuvers, it was all about to be revealed. The public would know the truth. But the final move needed to be made, and it had to be done carefully. Her enemies had already laid the groundwork for a media blitz. The night before, an anonymous tip had surfaced that accused her of corruption, of allowing political operatives to influence her decisions. It was a classic smear tactic, designed to strip her of her authority. But she was prepared. As the clock ticked toward the day of the press conference, Sotomayor stood in her office, taking one last look at the file in front of her. It was a detailed dossier of the conspiracy, complete with proof of the connections to political figures and the way they had tried to manipulate her every decision. But this wasn't about the documents anymore. This was about making sure that the truth came out. At the press conference, journalists gathered from across the nation, all eager to hear her side of the story. The room buzzed with anticipation. This was her moment, to clear her name and to send a message to the powerful forces that had tried to break her. She walked to the podium, her calm demeanor hiding the fire within. She knew the stakes. The media would be watching, but so would the world. Every word she spoke would be scrutinized, but it was the only way to ensure that justice prevailed. Ladies and gentlemen, Sotomayor began, her voice steady and unwavering, I stand before you today not just as a justice of the Supreme Court, but as a defender of the law, of truth, and of justice. Recently, I have been the target of a well-organized smear campaign designed to destroy my reputation and undermine the integrity of the judiciary. These attacks have been orchestrated by powerful forces who wish to control the very system meant to safeguard our democracy. The room fell silent as she continued. I will not stand by and allow these lies to fester. Today, I am releasing evidence that connects these individuals to a network of political operatives who sought to manipulate not just me, but the judicial process itself. This conspiracy goes deep, but I will expose it for what it is, an assault on the very principles of justice that we hold dear. She held up a series of documents, photographs, and records that traced the full extent of the operation. The media gasped, their skepticism quickly turning to shock. The evidence was undeniable. The connections to Gregory Hale and Thomas Avery, the political figures who had tried to manipulate the courts, were all laid bare for the world to see. I am not the only one they've targeted, Sotomayor continued, her voice growing stronger. There are others who will face similar attacks, but I stand here today to make sure that this does not happen again. We cannot allow our democracy to be compromised by the few who seek to bend the law for their own gain. The reporters were stunned into silence. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the shuffling of papers as they processed the magnitude of what they had just heard. This was no longer just a story about one woman's fight for her integrity, this was about the fight to preserve the very system of justice that underpins the nation. As the press conference drew to a close, Sotomayor took one final glance at the crowd. She knew this was only the beginning of the battle, but in this moment, she had won the first victory. The truth had come to light, and the people responsible for trying to manipulate the judiciary had been exposed. The consequences were swift. Political figures connected to the conspiracy were immediately under investigation, and several were forced to resign. The public outcry was deafening, and the push for judicial reforms gained significant traction. What began as a personal attack on one Supreme Court justice had evolved into a movement for greater transparency and accountability within the courts. As Sotomayor walked out of the press conference, the weight of the moment didn't escape her. She had been tested like never before, and though the journey had been painful, it had reaffirmed everything she believed in. The forces that sought to corrupt justice had failed. But the fight for the soul of the judiciary was far from over. With her family by her side, and the unwavering support of her colleagues on the court, Justice Sotomayor knew one thing for certain, justice had not only survived, it had triumphed. And as long as she drew breath, she would continue to fight for it.